Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for the webinar titled, How to Sharpen Your Advocacy in an Election Year. My name is Chris Rodriguez. I'm with the marketing team here at Phone to Action. I want to thank everyone for joining us, but first, I'd like to walk through a few housekeeping items. We will be live tweeting the event using hashtag #ElectionYearAdvocacy. We invite you to follow along and contribute and tag @Phone2Action on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You have two choices for how to listen to the event: over your computer's speakers or by dialing in over the phone. If you run into problems with your computer's audio, please call into the number provided by GoToWebinar. Next, we are recording this event and we'll be sending the link to all registrants along with the slide deck after the webinar has ended. And finally, after the presentation, we will have some time for questions. To submit a question for us, please type your question into the questions box on your control panel. If you run into any technical difficulties during today's presentation, please contact us via the chat window and we will assist you. Now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Jason Langsner.
Hello, everybody. This is Jason Langsner. I'm a senior product manager with Phone to Action. I have over 15 years experience in the advocacy and digital strategy space. I started my career with the Technology Trade Association, went on to work for a nonprofit, and then for the last 5 years before joining Phone to Action, I worked for America's First Business PAC that also provided grassroots advocacy tools. Today's agenda, we're going to first begin with introductions. We're going to then flow into talking about the current election landscape, discuss how organizations can set their goals and make a plan. We'll be discussing a blueprint for doing that with the Power Plan, which is a white paper that was recently released. And then, as Chris mentioned, we'll have plenty of time towards the end for Q&A. We have a great group of speakers assembled with us today, and I'd like each to introduce themselves and to set the tone for the webinar. I'd appreciate if each speaker also completes the sentence after this introduction. The 2020 election will be. And first, let's get started with Chris.
Hey, thanks so much, Jason. Thank you all for listening today. My name is Chris Freight. I am a journalist. I have 20 years of experience. I came out of newspapers, and in Washington, I worked for Politico when it started, National Journal, and I finished up at CNN as an on-air investigative correspondent. I founded the storytelling company and strategic communications firm Storyline, and I still do a show on SiriusXM called Politics Inside Out on the POTUS channel, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you all today. And I would say that the 2020 elections will be an opportunity to tell your story.
And Alex?
Hey,
Alex, are you with us?
Yeah, hey, can you hear me?
Yep, hear you loud and clear.
Hey, this is Alex Nemchevsky. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Ballot Ready. I started Ballot Ready because I know that most people, when they show up to vote, show up ready to vote for president or senator or governor, who's ever at the top of the ticket. But then when they get into the voting booth, they're faced with a ballot that has many more local offices and local candidates, and often people guess or leave blanks or just stay home altogether, especially in local elections that happen in non-presidential years. So Ballot Ready makes voter guides to everything on the ballot. Before that, I worked in workforce development and research, and 2020 is supposed to be the biggest turnout ever. So I'm excited to see that happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. And Leanne, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. My name is Leanne Paradise. I am the Senior Associate for Grassroots with the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. For those of you who are not familiar with NRECA, we represent rural electric cooperatives, which are small, mostly small, electric companies that are owned by the people that they serve. They started in rural communities and primarily still exist in rural communities. I've been with NRECA for about a year and a half now, and prior to that, spent about 10 years with the National Association of Manufacturers. So I'm really going to draw on experience from both of those organizations. I'll try to let you know if something pertains to one or the other. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all today. And I will complete the sentence. The 2020 election will be the first time we really see the millennials and Gen Z realize their political strength. I think they're motivated and ready. And I'll talk a little bit as we go through about some of the ways that we're looking to harness that motivation.
Excellent point. And Matt Fitting, can you please also introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jason. I am Matt Fitting. I'm Advocacy and Engagement Specialist here with the American Nurses Association. We work on behalf of the 4 million registered nurses in America. I focus mostly on federal policy, but in my position, I often work with our state associations. More than 13 years experience. I was previously at a volunteer-based association and have worked for all sorts of different entities on all sorts of different campaigns. And the 2020 election will be captivating, no matter how folks are necessarily feeling about heading into yet another presidential election year. It's going to be tough to look away for a number of reasons. So to Chris's point, that much more of an opportunity and that much more important for you to make sure your folks are engaged and that you're doing everything you can to get a spotlight on your issues.
Excellent. Well, also thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. We want to appreciate your time, so we're going to move things rather expeditiously. And so let's go ahead and begin. So Chris, we're about 159 days away from the start of the 2020 Iowa Democratic caucuses, which is the first nominating contest in the Democratic Party presidential primaries, and also the first bellwether test of a candidate's electability. As a storyteller, can you share with us what you're seeing so far with the 2020 presidential campaign and what you anticipate seeing between now and the start of these February 3rd caucuses?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Jason. So I think first we have to take a look at the elections as a whole, and experts predicting that 2020 is going to be the most expensive election in history. That tops the $6.5 billion that were spent on presidential and congressional elections back in 2016. And let's just break it down. On the House side, Democrats, of course, expected to keep control. You can see with the 12 Republicans announcing they're leaving office before 2020, Republicans not feeling really great about their chances there. Move over to the Senate. You have 12 Democratic seats up, 22 Republican seats. In most years, that would be a boon for the Democrats, but not so much this year. According to Cook's Political Report, you have 1 D toss-up state and 3 Republican toss-up states in Colorado, Arizona, and Maine. Democrats need to take back all 3 of those seats and win control of the White House. They need a clean sweep. If Trump wins, they need to win 4 seats to control the Senate. That's no easy feat. That would mean they have to hold Alabama with Senator Jones, and then they have to knock out Gardner, McSally, and Collins in Colorado, Arizona, and Maine. So what does that mean? That means there'll be millions of dollars spent in those 4 toss-up states. The presidential election itself expected to top $2.5 billion in spending. So that gives you an opportunity to ride the news wave, to surf the news wave, and looking at the themes that are starting to emerge when you talk about storytelling. Of course, you have healthcare, with Democrats talking about Medicare for all, lowering drug prices, and the future of the Affordable Care Act up in the air right now in the courts, being challenged as unconstitutional. That could change. So if you're in the healthcare space, whether or not you're talking about those issues, there are openings there for you to talk about your issues. Energy, the Green New Deal, climate change, all big issues. Immigration, who are we letting into the country? How do we grow our workforce? Technology and the future of work, data regulation, universal basic income, AI, automation, welcoming our robot overlords. How are we going to deal with this shift in work? Trade hits everything: agriculture, commercial, manufacturing, consumer price goods. What's that mean for you? That means in all these areas, there's a huge opportunity for you to get your message out, to frame your narrative, and to stake your narrative onto the trains that are already moving on the presidential level in the Democratic primary, and then in the general as President Trump tries to hold the White House, and also in key states and congressional districts where you might have an interest. There is a huge appetite for those kinds of narratives that you can help set now. The narratives that will govern the first 2 years of the next president's term and the next Congress are being established during this campaign. So you really need to think about how to get into the game so you're not left out. Thanks, Jason.
And Leanne, speaking about narratives and focusing on the U.S. Senate and House, can you speak a little bit about how NRECA is going to craft your narrative and engage your stakeholders?
Absolutely. So we really view advocacy as more than just lobbying. We really want to get our grassroots involved because co-ops began as a grassroots movement. So engaging with candidates at this point in the cycle is really all about getting their attention so we can start building relationships and begin talking about issues that we'll dive deeper into down the road. We really make it a point to preach to our members the virtues of bringing candidates from all levels, but especially presidential, Senate, House, into their co-ops before they're even elected, to visit the site, to meet their employees. We really have found that there's no more effective way of creating that emotional hook and that bond that will help them remember us and what we're fighting for. Our folks in Kansas do an especially effective job of that. They really challenged their co-ops in the 2016 election cycle to bring in a candidate for any office into each and every one of their co-ops. They accomplished that in the first cycle, and they're doing that still and already starting for 2020. Additionally, in critical, especially battleground states, candidate intercepts and getting to them at their events can be really, really effective and just as important. Our folks in Iowa obviously do a really good job with this, but they started a program that has expanded to the House and Senate called Iowa Rural Power. Essentially, they send volunteers in green shirts. They are bright green, very identifiable, and they ask their volunteers to ask a very simple question of every candidate. How will your energy plan provide affordable and reliable power to rural Iowa? They record the answer to that question. They later release it, at least in presidential years, they have in the past, as a sort of voter guide, and get their people involved and aware of what the answers are to that question. The candidates begin to recognize those green shirts and engage more readily with them as time goes on, because they know that the person behind that asking the question is from a co-op. They can trust what the question is going to be, and they have an answer ready for it. And that helps pave the way for future conversations with those same advocates, as well as our lobbyists, and establishes a level of trust. So it really begins before election happens, and that's where we're laying the groundwork right now.
Outstanding. So we talked a little bit about the presidential, the House, and the Senate. So let's start looking about the state election landscapes. So Matt, thankfully there are nurses in every single state out there. Can you talk a little bit about ANA's work and what we're looking at the election landscape with gubernatorial races both in 2019 and in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the 2019 elections are always interesting as bellwethers. I say this as someone who actually worked all the way back in 2007 in Kentucky on a race in which Steve Beshear eventually won the gubernatorial election in Kentucky, and now, of course, his son is running. So that's interesting and makes me feel a little bit old. But putting that to the side, when you talk about state elections, I think about Kelly Armstrong. Kelly Armstrong now represents North Dakota. He has the at-large seat in the House of Representatives here in Washington. Prior to that, he worked in the state legislature. And when I got to sit down with him when he was running, he told me about how he had worked closely with our state association on workplace violence legislation that they were working on in North Dakota. Nurses are more likely to face incidents of workplace violence than police officers or prison guards. It's a very, very serious issue that we are working in a number of ways to combat. But so based on that experience, when he got here, he understood why we were working on a federal piece of legislation geared toward workplace violence. So when you talk about state races, that's an example that immediately comes to mind for me. I think also there's an opportunity there. I think it's perfectly fair for some folks to think back to 2016 and perhaps not remember that presidential election very fondly, and thus maybe are not overwhelmed with joy about another one coming up. But the opportunity to make a difference in state races is really huge. It still holds true, and I say this as somebody who's fairly ambivalent about it, given that I, as I said, focus a lot on federal policy. But at the state level, things get done. because they have to. And so I think that's a really important way for you to keep your folks engaged. If maybe, the top of the ticket isn't necessarily bowling them over with enthusiasm, there's just so many important opportunities, particularly with gubernatorial elections in the 11 states that you see there. But even beyond that, with the state legislatures themselves, and of course, with redistricting coming up as well, which I know we're going to touch on a little bit more.
And Alex, you referenced individuals going into the ballot box and not necessarily knowing about the down ballot candidates. Can you speak a little bit about the state legislatures that are up in 2020 and some of the things that you're experiencing and you're hearing from individuals with Ballot Ready? Yeah,
we've seen that often people don't even know there are going to be other offices on the ballot other than, who's ever at the top of the ticket. But sometimes, and we've seen that when people are shown information about their whole ballot, they are 20% more likely to turn out when controlling for demographics and voting history. We also know that people know that voting in local elections matters a lot, and voting further down the ballot matters a lot. They know that their votes count more because there are fewer number of votes altogether, and they know that important issues are decided at the local level, whether it's, really hot issues like gun control, education, healthcare. A lot of impactful decisions are made at that level. So we've seen that people are hungry for more information. So that's why we exist, to put information out there on who's running, background information about them, and making it really easy for voters to find out when and where they can go vote.
And Alex made a really good point. It's not just who you're voting for, but it's also what you're voting for. We're currently tracking 38 state ballot measures so far across 18 states coming up. Leanne, you've had some experience working with ballot measures. Can you talk about some of the work that NRECA has done specific to previous ballot measures and how you've engaged your advocates and stakeholders there?
Yeah, absolutely. If you haven't seen a ballot measure come into your issue space yet, it's coming to a door near you very soon. We've had a couple different issues pop up in multiple locations, one being deregulation. That's now hit the ballot, and they're trying to put it back on the ballot again in Florida twice. So we're keeping a very close eye on that. The one that I was closest to, however, was last cycle out in Arizona. A group called Citizens for a Healthy Arizona came into the state, proposed a ballot initiative that would have changed the Constitution to mandate that 50% of the power generated in the state come from clean and renewable resources by 2030. It's a very admirable goal, but this posed an existential threat to the way that our co-ops are able to serve their members. Our generation and transmission co-op estimated that it would have raised electric bills by about 40%. Our co-ops tend to represent the areas in the state that are much more poverty-driven than other parts. So this really was something that we saw as a huge threat, not just in Arizona, but wherever it spreads next. It also popped up in Michigan and Nevada. Michigan was able to negotiate a deal on it, and it ended up not going to the ballot. Nevada had already seen it in the previous election cycle. They have to vote on their ballot measures twice, and it died on the second vote that was taken last year. So our folks on the ground really did a strong social media campaign, but they also blended that with some very boots on the ground traditional tactics that really worked well in rural areas. One of those that we assisted them with was an op-ed campaign. We worked with them to find folks who had really compelling stories related to, what would happen if this passed, and turn those into not just op-eds, but letters to some elected officials to kind of shore up support there. But we ended up placing a couple dozen op-eds in small local hometown newspapers around the state. They also held town hall meetings with their consumer members and sent messages to those consumer members from the co-op leadership about how it would affect their co-op specifically. It ended up being the most expensive ballot initiative in Arizona history. By election day, at least $55 million had been spent, and that may have even gone up since we pulled these numbers. But $30 million was spent by APS, which is the big investor-owned utility in the state, and more than $24 million was pumped in by Citizens for a Healthy Arizona. Very, very emotional issue, obviously, and with consistent messaging about cost, local control, and reliability, we were able to really see that fall in a big way. It ended up being defeated with almost 69% of the vote. Now, that's one instance, but we recognize that this is not isolated and this is not going to stay just in Arizona. So internally, what we're talking about doing now is putting together a team of NRECA staff who has experience now with these ballot initiatives, sort of a go team to help fight these where they crop up. Wouldn't be issue specific, but it would be a cross-functional team, including grassroots, including our policy teams, communications, legal, et cetera, that could really help build a campaign when we see one of these crop up. This is increasingly part of the public policy process. Like I said, if you haven't seen it yet, you're going to very soon. So we need to be ready to address them up.
Oh, yes, and Leanne was talking a little bit about metrics and quantifiable measures. So I think one of the important things also that we can look about is getting out the vote and the expected voter turnout specific to numbers. And Chris, could you talk a little bit, you referenced earlier the opportunity of 2020. Can you discuss how you look at potentially measuring that opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you look at the expected turnout for this election, it's going to be huge at 156 million. In the 2018 election, we had record turnout for a midterm, one of the biggest turnouts in a century at 120 million. It's going to be the game in town. This idea of how do you engage people if you're talking to your executives, if you're making a case, well, why do we need to tell our story around the election? Why do we need to surf this wave? All you need to do is look at these numbers. It's the flip side of our opening slide. There's going to be billions spent to get people's attention, so those skids are already greased for you and your organization. But not only that, you have an audience that wants to be engaged. A record projected turnout of over 150 million people, half the country is going to be tuned in. And it's a big difference from previous elections in that they actually want to hear from you. So when you take that combined with the fact that in 2020, there won't be much of a congressional legislative agenda, that there won't be much getting done in Washington. The game is going to be played out in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, and the other primary states. It's a very persuasive argument to your organization about why they need to get their heads in this game.
And Matt, can you speak a little bit to that about how you're looking at getting out the nurses vote?
Absolutely. So 1 out of every 40 voters is a registered nurse. So it's very, very important for us to make sure that they are turning out. Additionally, Gallup polling every year for the last 17 years has found that the public views nurses as the most honest and ethical profession. So that creates a real opportunity for us. We want to make sure that our nurses certainly are getting out to vote, but also that they are engaging with the campaigns to make sure that nursing issues are front and center. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about healthcare at the presidential level, and I'm sure we will in the other races as well, and really setting the stage so that folks are asking, whenever anything healthcare related comes up, well, what do nurses think about that? In terms of engaging our folks, I'll say that our Nurses Vote campaign last cycle in 2018 was very successful. This is a partnership that we did with Phone to Action and their Voting Action Center, where nurses could put in their information and find out whether they were registered, if they're not registered, how to get registered. For nurses, it's very, very important, to know how to vote absentee or vote early. I actually hail from Pennsylvania originally, and last year in 2018, on Election Day, the polls opened at 7 a.m. and they closed at 8 p.m. It is very possible, in fact, I'm sure this was the case somewhere, that a nurse could have a shift that completely takes up that time. So very, very important that they have all the information they need to make sure that they are in the best position to cast their ballot and make sure it counts.
And Leanne, you had referenced Gen Z first-time voters. Can you talk a little bit about NRECA, or maybe Alex jump in as well, about how you were looking at engaging these first-time voters?
Yeah, so we are very fortunate within NRECA to have an extraordinarily robust youth program called the Youth Tour, and from that we get what's referred to as the Youth Leadership Council. These are sort of the best of the best and are chosen by their peers to be part of a special leadership training. Obviously in the last election, we saw an enormous boom in youth voter engagement. It actually rose by 79%. I pulled the number. That key demographic between 18 and 29-year-olds turned out in massive numbers in the last election. So our kids and the ones who are coming up right now, both Gen Z and the end of the millennial generation, really have dealt with and seen sort of the consequences and action or inaction in some cases by government. And I think that's really motivating them in massive numbers. The one sort of issue that really jumps out for me from conversations with our kids has been the opioid crisis. You know, these kids are kind of on the front line of that and are seeing what it's doing to the community. So we're working with our youth program to kind of harness that motivation and to bring them in and have them fully participate in the Co-ops Vote program. We actually just introduced at the end of the fall a sort of incentive program for them to get to different levels and be recognized when they come back and speak at annual meeting next year. So we are looking for new ways to pull them in as part of the National Co-ops Vote program, which is our nonpartisan voter engagement program. It was our response to the decline in voter turnout in rural areas. We worked through our co-ops through what we call the 5-star program. We asked them to do 5 voter engagement activities each election cycle, and then they get this distinction, which they can use on their website and use as sort of a badge of honor. We've even had states challenge each other to see who can get the most to be 5 stars, that kind of thing. So it's really been an effective way of getting folks involved. We're also now a premier partner for National Voter Registration Day as well. We started that last year, and in fact, my colleague Laura Vogel is now on their National Steering Committee. So that's been a big part of our drive to get folks involved, and we did tie National Voter Registration Day into the youth programs as well.
That's great. And before we move ahead on tactics and strategy, Alex, did you want to talk a little bit about how an individual can bring their ballot into the ballot box on their smartphone?
Yeah, so at Ballot Ready, everything we make is mobile first designed. And that's one, so in most places, voters can bring their phone into the voting booth so they can research the candidates or save the candidates that they want to vote for ahead of time. But also we know that organizations want to reach voters through digital ads, and we know that especially younger people are sharing on social media. So having it mobile friendly makes it easier to access at all times. But also we recently learned an interesting stat that the age when people stop accessing the internet for more than 2 hours a day on their phone, the age drop off is 75. So it's not just young people that are using mobile phones, it's everybody.
Outstanding. So I feel we've got a great overview of the upcoming election. So let's go ahead and transition to discussing the tactical and strategic objectives of setting our goals and making our plans to engage and educate our advocates. So for our speakers, let's dive into how, beyond engaging and educating, we also should intend to motivate our employees, retirees, members, donors, volunteers, business partners, and all stakeholders to participate in the election. So, Alex, you're talking about the amount of candidates. Could you talk about the who, the what, and the where of setting these objectives?
Sorry, I
or
think this
Chris,
is...
are you able to? Oh, I'm sorry,
Sure.
Is that Alex still? Chris, why don't you just go ahead and jump in on the who, what, and where of what we're anticipating seeing for 2020?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And when you look at 156 million people who are going to be involved in this election, that's a huge number, right? So how do you create meaningful engagement? And I think you have to develop a narrative and you have to reach people and starting with the question, who's our audience? Everything starts there. Is it policymakers, the media? Is it donors? Is it customers? And once you know who you're talking to, find those validators, find those characters who can tell your story for you that resonates with your audience. Right? So if that's farmers, teachers, parents, finding the real people, not the suits from your organization, not your staffers, but real people. Those could be your members, but you need to put real people in places where they can resonate with that audience. And where are they going to resonate? They're going to resonate in those key states, those primary states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. Do you have key congressional seats where your issues are key? You have key candidates. Find the constituents who are going to speak to those members. And if you have primary voters talking about your issue, candidates are going to take notice. Leanne made that point with the bright green shirts. Those candidates knew her members because they were engaged. Tell those stories. Use video. Use the internet, and then once you have created content around those stories, make sure you are promoting it and you are targeting that key audience that you started with.
Yeah, this is Leanne. Can I jump in really quick here too? One of the things that I'll say related to issues especially, the issues that your organization covers may be very important, but think about ways that you can maybe reframe some of the issues that are a lot more technical into something that's going to be more digestible by your members, more digestible by the general public, and easier for a candidate to talk about. For us, let's say we have a lot of issues around pole attachments, things that can be attached to electrical poles and how much are charged. Nobody cares about that. What they care about is that may affect how broadband service gets delivered to them and on what timeline they're looking at because of, the regulations around these pole attachments. So talking about broadband access instead of pole attachments is going to be a lot easier for us. The other thing I'll say is that look at what the candidates are talking about in terms of issues. In 2016, when I was with the manufacturers, infrastructure was an enormous issue, and everybody was talking about it out on the campaign trail. So rather than hit the candidates with our full agenda, we really focused on our infrastructure plan, sent them that, and ended up having detailed conversations with the Clinton campaign. It ended up making parts of it made their way into the platform for the GOP. So kind of look around and see what's really being discussed and focus your fire on that.
And Max, can you speak a little bit about just how you go ahead and cut through the noise to make your message from ANA heard through the nurses?
Absolutely. So for us, we really wanted to emphasize visibility. We also wanted to tackle a challenge that we face on an ongoing basis, but particularly when it comes to this, which is that our nurses are advocating for their patients every day at the bedside. But when we come to them and need them to advocate in the sense that we mean it in terms of policy and government affairs, they can be a little more reticent for various reasons. So we went with a tried and true swag. We fashioned a button. It said registered, and then underneath it said nurse and voter, and there was a box next to both nurse and voter, and both boxes were checked. So very simple, very straightforward, but folks really, really responded to it. And what we did was we emailed our advocates and we said, we have this voting action center that I alluded to earlier. And the first, I think it was 7,500 people to go there and enter your information are going to get a button. And we saw a great, great response. If you go to Twitter and you search for the hashtag nurses vote, you'll have to do just a little bit of scrolling, but not too much, to see last November, tons and tons of photos of nurses wearing their button as they were heading to their polling location, wearing them right alongside the I voted sticker. And it really accomplished for us what we wanted then and what we're aiming to do again here in 2020, which is empowering our nurses. That's really the name of the game for us. We know that like the general public, they have various views, various political affiliations. That's not the concern for us in terms of the Nurses Vote Initiative. We just want them to feel empowered. And that certainly, goes for on election day itself. But again, prior to that, making sure that they're engaging with campaigns, that they're going to town halls, that they're asking, their candidates where they stand on issues relevant to nursing. But I think it all starts with, again, showcasing the fact that our nurses are out there, they're showing their pride with their buttons. And when other folks see that, that encourages them to mobilize as well.
Excellent. And Matt, you were talking about mobilization. Perhaps Leanne can jump in and talk about how you measure that mobilization with your KPIs. Could you talk a little bit about how NAM or NRECA was measuring your GOTV efforts?
Yeah, that's always a difficult challenge. With the NAM, the manufacturers, we really looked at a couple of different dynamics. The first was sort of the influence that we were having with candidates. And that came back to us in a couple different forms. Obviously, I mentioned getting, the infrastructure plan into some of the platforms and some of the talking points that were being used by the campaigns. Another measure that we used for that was our candidate questionnaire. I don't necessarily advise you to go down the road of doing a candidate questionnaire, but when we were able to focus it in specific states that we knew were battlegrounds, both for the presidential and the Senate, we really did get a higher rate of return on that than we ever had before. In terms of how things are resonating with our members, again, in 2016, we partnered with a firm called TurboVote, which is run by Democracy, blank on the name, but TurboVote is an online voter registration platform. You can go in, answer a few specific questions. This was what looked like very early AI technology, where it would ask you a progressive series of questions. You would end up with a completed voter registration form and be able to send that in. We looked at the metrics coming back from that and realized that we had registered, I think, over 800 new voters through our efforts on that. So it's hard because you can't obviously estimate the number of people that are part of your organization that are going to the polls. But looking at quality and trying to find some quantitative measures is possible. Another one that we're seeing good things with here at NRECA is through our Facebook channels. We've grown our Facebook presence enormously in the last couple of election cycles, and our Co-ops Vote channel is actually larger than our Cooperative Action Network channel, as well as our primary NRECA channel.
And I know from my experience with Phone to Action, speaking with a number of clients, they've also looked at the number of advocates that have come into their advocate counts for finding their candidates, finding their polling place, really using GOTV as a part of their broader grassroots strategy. So speaking about strategy, let's talk a little bit about the blueprint, the power plan that was recently released with Phone to Action, and provide some actual direction for those on the phone for taking steps for creating your 2020 programs as of today. So Alex, can you talk a little bit about how to plan around certain events that are calendar specific coming up?
I think the first step is getting the calendar yourself of when all the debates are, when all the primaries are, but not only that, when is National Voter Registration Day? When does early voting start in for all the primaries and stuff like that? This is a great useful slide that we'll have afterward, so you can keep track of those key dates. And then knowing that, it can be tempting to start earlier, but a lot of the time voters aren't paying attention until, honestly, election day or the day before. So I think it's always useful to have information out there and obviously start reaching out way beforehand, but knowing that the increase in attention will happen much closer to election day and debates.
So we've got the P for the plan around your events, And let's talk about the O, to organize your advocates. Leanne, can you speak about the different tools that you're using to organize your NRECA advocates?
Yeah, this is an area where we've actually spent about the last 8-9 months investigating some new techniques and seeing what's out there on the market. We've really been kind of singing a one-note song for a while with our advocacy engagements. We've been using nothing but email. Email is still good. Email is still something that you need to keep as part of your portfolio, but there are so many other channels out there right now that get to people where they want to be spoken to and in the way that they want to be spoken to. So we're really looking at how we can diversify our communications capabilities. As I mentioned, obviously, our Facebook channels are a big source for that. We do have a slightly older population in rural communities, and they tend to be older and more female on Facebook. So this is a really strong segment for us right now, and we want to start leveraging that a lot more. We're also looking at text technology, and we did a very successful trial with Phone to Action last week in San Francisco. We had a conference for all of our benefits and human resources administrators, and we asked them to take action via a live call to action on a particular piece of legislation related to pensions. We ended up with more than almost 500 messages, going into the U.S. Senate on this particular piece of legislation in less than 5 minutes. Our audience had never seen anything like that before, and they were blown away. We actually shot video of it, just watching the map and the pins drop into place. So we're starting to see potential applications for this down the road as well, that we may be able to tap into. It's all about integrating things into a process that already works. So we're looking at how we can grow that in the future and really make it more relevant, more easily accessible to our members.
And the second part of discussing the channels and tools is also looking about those details, those 500 individuals in 5 minutes. So Matt, can you talk a little bit about audience messaging when it comes to ANA?
Absolutely. So I mentioned our Nurses Vote site from last cycle. We are in the process of expanding and enhancing that dedicated website. And going back to National Voter Registration Day, we're going to be rolling it out around that time this year. And of course, next year we'll be talking it up again. So it really is, I think, keeping in mind that calendar and letting that be your guide in terms of how you're getting to your folks and making sure that you're reaching them where they are. Of course, we'll be doing email messaging. That doesn't go away, but we've certainly noticed in the 2+ years that we've worked with Phone to Action, our SMS-based community has been growing steadily, and we've seen really impressive rates of engagement from that group, which is great. I think, again, it all comes back to the calendar, and that sort of fuels all of this. So when we're talking to our folks, we want to make sure that as those various states are holding their primaries, that the members in those states are engaging, and then beyond that, that folks in other states know that they're engaging. So for example, our executive director in New Hampshire, as you can imagine, has already attended a number of events and interacted with a number of candidates, and that's a really great opportunity to talk about an issue like opioids, which I know was referenced earlier, and to come at it from our angle, which for us, that just happens to be it's very important for us that advanced practice registered nurses are permitted via relevant legislation to administer certain types of treatment to those suffering from opioid addiction. Not everybody running for president might necessarily know that, and we want to make sure that they do. And even beyond running for president, anybody running for office anywhere should know how important nurses are to addressing that issue and addressing other health issues as well. And so that's sort of, that speaks to our organization's voice. It's all about, for us, the focus has to be on our members, on those 4 million registered nurses, and making sure that in terms of keeping it fresh and engaging, making sure that folks know that we're approaching it from that angle and that we're sort of helping candidates and voters as well understand issues that, I think everybody has probably seen or heard or read a story about the opioid crisis, but maybe not in the way that I just described from that nursing angle. So that's really, really important there as well. The last thing I'll say is, again, going back to the calendar, we certainly plan to engage with the conventions next summer. Our aim tentatively right now is to make sure our senior leadership and other relevant stakeholders are there and engaging. And there again, we want folks to know that we're doing that, particularly our members, because once they know that, they'll understand that makes their membership all that more important, much more important, and the work that we do can be more impactful as a result as well.
And Chris, Matt was talking about voice. So the next two letters on our power plan are the W to write your relevant content and the E to educate your advocates. As this resident storyteller, can you speak about framing a narrative to benefit an organization's goals?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to frame and create a narrative about your issue and explain why it matters. And one of the easiest ways to think about this was a conversation I had with Mark McKinnon, the Republican strategist, the host of The Circus on Showtime, and we were talking about storytelling. And he said Paul Begala, the Democratic strategist, had a great framework for storytelling in campaigns. There's 5 questions. What's the threat or the opportunity? Who are the victims? What is the villain? What's the resolution? And then you present the hero. So let's take Donald Trump's campaign, for instance. What's the opportunity? Make America great again. What's the threat? The Chinese, Mexicans, the media elite. Who are the victims? Hardworking, blue-collar Americans who are just trying to do the right thing and feel like they're getting cheated. Who or what is the villain? Democrats, media, immigrants, bad trade deals. So what's the resolution? Build a wall, tear up the trade deals, drain the swamp. Who's the hero? Donald Trump. Say what you want about Donald Trump. He told a story about what he would do for America, and he made it emotional. And that's because feelings lead to action. And that's just not me saying it, that's science. If you take a look at neuroscientist Antonio Damasio studied people with damage to the part of their brain where emotions are generated. They seemed normal, except they couldn't feel emotion. And that meant there was something else they couldn't do. They couldn't make decisions. Feelings lead to action. You need to engage your audience in a way that there is an action, and so know what your call to action is. Once you've made them feel something, have them take that action. Is that calling a representative? Is that going out to register to vote? Is that bringing people to the polls? What do you need them to do? Make sure you take advantage of that moment to call them to action. And then, of course, keep telling it. Repetition is key. And when you look at the kind of work we do here at Storyline, we had a client who was trying to make the case that the Environmental Protection Agency was not enforcing its laws, that they weren't getting the job done. But how do you make people care about that? We went and found a small town in southeastern Ohio, at an hour from Pittsburgh, across the river from West Virginia. One side of town was an industrial plant that was throwing manganese, the heavy metal in the air, in such high quantities as a public health hazard. You could see it coating the outside walls of the houses in that town. On the other end of town, a toxic waste incinerator, the world's largest when it was built, exploded, threw toxic ash all over that town. We went and found the residents who lived there, the mom whose daughter had cancer 4 times before she was 30, whose son has glaucoma, the woman who lives behind the toxic waste incinerator and whose family and grandchildren have moved away to be safer, because they could tell an emotional story. They could say, we have no protection, nobody will buy our houses, and we are the victims. We set up that narrative to make people feel a policy. And that's the kinds of things that we do at Storyline and that you need to do with your narrative to break through and to have an impact.
And we all know elections move really fast. So the last part of the power plan is to make sure that you as an organization are able to react quickly. And that has something to do with technology. So Alex, as our CEO of a civic technology company, can you talk a little bit about how someone can, or how an organization can be able to react quickly?
So just knowing that unfortunately, elections can't wait. They're happening. They're happening quickly. So ways reaching people via text, SMS, email, tweets, phone campaigns, like this all says. It's best ahead of time to have a comms plan ready so that you have everything planned and you have plans for best and worst case scenarios.
Excellent. I could not agree more. You don't want to be surprised. Surprises don't work out really well for businesses, so the more you can plan, the better. As we started in the beginning of the session, we wanted to make sure that there's ample time for Q&A at the end. As a reminder, you could add your questions within the chat box in the software for GoToWebinar on the box right there. Let's go ahead and get started with our first question. So there was a recent case study that the Harvard Kennedy School released about civic engagement and voter turnout. They saw that organizations were successful when they made clear efforts about strengthening democracy, not advocating for a particular candidate or party. The co-author said that these organizations prioritized voters. Leanne and Matt, can you speak about how your organizations are prioritizing voters?
I'll take this one first. I think we're very fortunate in the fact that the co-op movement really is a democratic movement in the way that it's structured. We have democratic control over the way that the co-ops are run, and people seem to understand the need to be involved civically, both in their community and within the co-op. So we really have played to that that theme and that emotion with Co-ops Vote. This is not a partisan activity. This is something that is about voting and good government, and that really resonates with our people. It's the easiest way to get them involved. We also occasionally encounter, and I'm sure, Matt, you can speak to this too, there are always going to be a few who don't, will come back and say, don't tell me how to vote. Well, it's not about telling people how to vote. It's just about telling them to go vote. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, certainly. Yeah, I agree with all of that, certainly. And I think, for us, it's not, it is certainly because we want our nurses to be empowered. Like I said, that's the name of the game. It's really important. And that is in and of itself a good thing. But we also know that if they are engaging during the election process and with voting itself, well, once those folks get elected, we have a bunch of people who are used to engaging and are probably going to be more likely to keep engaging when we start saying, all right, these people are in office, whoever they are, whatever party they're from. Now we need to move forward on our advocacy agenda. We need to make sure that we're helping our APRNs to treat patients with opioid addiction, like I referenced. We're trying to move the ball forward on nursing workforce and education development and home health care, all these various things. Well, those folks who engaged and who we got to engage with the election process and vote, now they're used to it. Now they're more likely to engage to help us advance our advocacy agenda. So there's a little bit of what's in it for us going on as well.
And we have a question from Amber Peterson. She's asking, is the work pretty, is it pretty liberal learning at its core? The organization is pretty liberal. They've wanted to see about managing to keep the operations pretty nonpartisan. How can Amber's organization maintain that during this political cycle?
It's going to be harder during this political cycle. I understand the concern. I say frequently when we're working with our members, it's possible to talk politics without being political. I mean, give everything that you talk about in terms of issues a foundation in fact, and be able to point back to that. And yeah, keep it about good citizenship, good government. That's how we both within NRECA and with the manufacturers manage to keep this sort of above partisan politics.
We also at Ballot Ready do a lot of work with both C4s, PACs, and C3s. And the most basic way of being nonpartisan is showing basic information about when and where to vote, how to register, and here's who's going to be on your ballot. But you can also create content that is nonpartisan, but sort of touches on issues while remaining nonpartisan.
I would just add that for us, and we're, again, finalizing this website where we're talking about, just giving a rundown for all the presidential candidates that are out there. And we've been very deliberate about making sure that we are playing up all the ways in which they have supported nurses, however that may be. Bills they've supported, the current administration has done some positive things, again, around advanced practice registered nurses. So just keeping the focus there. Again, I know nurses are a little bit unique in that regard, but working to find the positive things candidates have done for your issues and really focusing on that. In addition to, I think that good government angle is really important as well.
And we have a question from Bridget Brennan as well. This is for Chris. She was asking if you could repeat those 6 steps for Trump's storytelling, specific to the goal, the villain, the resolution, the hero, etc.
Sure, no problem, Bridget. So these are kind of 5 pillars that any narrative is going to have. I just use Donald Trump as an example of how he filled that in because I think he did it so well. Those 5 again. What is the threat or the opportunity? Who are the victims? Who or what is the villain? What's the resolution? And then you present the hero. So that narrative, that framework will work for any organization, for any issue that you're trying to think, how do we tell this story? Start with those 5 questions and then fill it out. My example with Donald Trump was, what's the opportunity? He answered by making America great again. The threat? Chinese, Mexicans, the media and political elite. Who were the victims of all of that? Hardworking Americans. Who or what was the villain? Well, Democrats, the media, immigrants, bad trade deals. So what's the resolution? Build a wall, tear up the trade deals, drain the swamp. Who's the hero? Donald Trump. I alone can fix it. He presented himself to the American people as a hero. He followed that classic narrative storytelling framework to a T, Bridget.
Outstanding. And I wanted to just thank all of our speakers and also thank all of our participants for spending this last hour with us. So for those on the East Coast, thank you for spending your lunch with us. And for those on the West Coast, good morning. So in conclusion, we would just like to say that we hope you learned something new about how to sharpen your advocacy efforts in this election year during this webinar. But if you'd like to learn more or to download the Power Plan, you could visit the link on the website. As well as if you would like to email or call us, we'd be happy to walk you through how you could use the phone to action tools to better engage your advocates for 2019 and 2020. As said, this webinar is being recorded and will be available, as well are the slides for anybody that would like it. And thank you again for participating, and we really hope that you do your best to help power your own get out the vote efforts to help elect those individuals who are the most meaningful for your organizations, to educate your stakeholders about the issues and the candidates that are important to you, and also to just engage in a civic fashion in 2019 and 2020. Thank you so much and have a great day.